All right, guys, I'm back up. I need somebody to tell me if you can hear me or not. I got showing 14 people online right now, so if someone can give me a heads up, because I don't want to keep talking and having no one hear anything. So somebody please just go ahead and put something on the live chat and let me know if you can hear or not. Okay, I'm assuming no one's hearing anything. So, yeah, I hate doing dead air. I'm going to put the music back on. All right, I just had a couple text messages come in saying you guys can hear me. Do me a favor. I'm not going to be able to see all the text messages just because, I mean, I can have like 30 people texting me at the same time, so there's no way I can watch both the screen and the PowerPoint and everything I'm doing. So now that you can hear me, cool. That's awesome. So basically, I'm going to go ahead and get started here. Sorry for the mix-up. I'm not even sure what happened here. I just went back into the program and just started hitting a lot of buttons until I saw my little indicator showing that it was reading stuff. So again, try not to text me messages if you messages if you have questions. Just go ahead and type them into the live chat because that's really all I have a clear view on while I'm doing this. So anyway, let's get started. Doing the Gilded Age, here we go. What I was trying to say earlier is that Mark Twain used this term, the Gilded Age, to talk about the time period between 1865 and 1898. And basically what he was saying was that you can cover anything in gold and it might cover it well, it might look real pretty, but in all honesty, there's a bunch of garbage underneath. And that's kind of what was going on in the United States during the Gilded Age, is that we had a lot of good things happening. We had a lot of, growth. We had a lot of industrialization. We had, a lot of new inventions coming in. And so, the United States was becoming this great economic power. But here at home, underneath all that really good stuff, there was a lot of garbage. And so that's a lot of the stuff in the Gilded Age that we're going to talk about during this time. Basically, where we're going to start is we're going to start with President Grant and what's going on in his presidency. And of course, now this is not working. So hold on, guys. I'll get it. Don't worry. There we go. Cancel. Cancel. All right, there we go. All right, so in Grant's presidency, the first big scandal that's going to come around is going to be what's called this Black Gold conspiracy. Be familiar with that. Be familiar with, you know, with the conspiracy, who the two guys were, and everything like that. Jay Gold and Jim Fisk. The easy way to remember it is, you know, the Gold conspiracy, Jay Gold. That's one way you can do it. Other conflicts during Grant's presidency is going to be the Tweed Ring. That's Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall, and what went on with that, with the corruption there. After the Tweed Ring, basically, you know, that Thomas Nast is going to come out with a lot of different cartoons. Thomas Nast plays a key role during the Gilded Age because using political cartoons, he's going to shed a light on all the corruption that's going on during this time. Other scandals during the big one during Grant's presidency is going to be the Credit Mobilier scandal. That has to do with the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. The railroad being built, the first Transcontinental Railroad started again with the Pacific Railway Act in 1862. That is going to be built by two companies. That's going to be the company of the Central Pacific Railroad coming from the West Coast and the Union Pacific Railroad coming from the East Coast. Now listen, basically what you want to know about the Transcontinental Railroad is what it did to our country, what it did as the good and the bad of the railroad. We had a lot of, you know, growth in our country with communication, industrialization, everything, and the idea is we want to get as much as of our goods between the East Coast and the West Coast, and the Transcontinental Railroad is going to be able to do that for us. However, with the Transcontinental Railroad, what we're going to see is a lot of destruction as far as the environment, as far as the Native Americans, and as far as the buffalo. And we talked a lot about that in class, so just be familiar with that and what went on there. The other thing, the salary or the whiskey ring fraud is another big one that happened during Grant's presidency. That's going to be when his agents in his administration are going to basically pilfer money off the top from collected whiskey taxes from the different distillers throughout our country. Another fraud or another scandal during his presidency is going to be the Salary Grab Act. And I don't have that up on the screen, but the Salary Grab Act was when Congress actually during this time voted in a new a new raise for themselves. They basically doubled their salary, and in doing so, they're going to double the salary of the president too. Now, what's going to happen is we're actually going to have an amendment that's going to come in that's going to fix that, where they're not allowed to vote themselves a raise, or they can vote themselves a raise, but that raise will not take effect until the next term. So that is all because of the Salary Grab Act. Grant's presidency, you know, it kind of sets the tone for the Gilded Age, because what happens with Grant's presidency is we see the influx of all this corruption, and this corruption is going to become kind of like the mainstay for this time period. It's not just going to happen in Grant's presidency, it's going to happen throughout the Gilded Age. And maybe not always with the presidents, but definitely with business and how they're run. Local governments especially are going to see a lot of corruption, and we see that a lot. The perfect example is Boss Tweed and Tammany Hall and what went on there with the building of the New York City courthouse. But Boss Tweed is just kind of use him as an example of what's going on in all the major cities. We have these political machines rising, and these political machines, whether they're Republican or Democrat, are going to go ahead and align themselves with the big business, and they're going to work together to improve the lives of, really the rich, but also create this huge wage gap between the rich and the poor. And that's going to be kind of the theme throughout the Gilded Age. Now, the Gilded Age is built on industrialization. And while industrialization is a fantastic thing for our country, it's not great for the individual, because what we see with the industrial age is we see huge economic growth, but then we also see urban growth as well, but also taking advantage of the worker, taking advantage of the lack of government oversight, because during the industrial age, during the Gilded Age, we're operating on laissez-faire politics. The government wants hands off. We have a Republican government, and the Republicans really believed in keeping out of day-to-day business. They didn't want to regulate too much. They believed in free capitalism. And so that's the consequences that we're going to see from this during the industrial age. Is we're going to see, people and things being taken advantage of. So we're going to go through that. Basically, the Industrial Revolution, a lot of stuff is going to be going on. I'm jumping through my notes here, and I'm not exactly where I want to be. We have introductions of new processes, new tariffs. The Morrill Tariff of 1861 is going to establish very high protective tariffs. The protective tariffs are there to help the big business. Another thing that's passed in the 1860s is the National Banking Act. This is going to provide a banking system and sound money. And what this is going to do is they're going to work with the railroads. And in working with the railroads, they're going to expand the growth of our country. They're going to expand the transportation of our industrial goods. But there's going to be a price to pay with our railroads. The railroads, honestly, if you want to give anything the credit for the industrial growth in our country, you've got to give it to the railroads. The railroads are going to be able to transport goods from sea to shining sea, if you will. And so keep that in mind. When you think Gilded Age, honestly, the first thing you should think of is the railroads. The government is actually going to protect a lot of the corporations during this time. We see that the Supreme Court is actually going to rule that corporations are people, and in doing that, the corporations will be protected by the 14th Amendment. It's almost like the 14th Amendment is going to shield the corporations from the federal government. And not necessarily that they need that shielding, because we are in a laissez-faire style of politics. But that idea that corporations are individuals is very important during the Gilded Age. A lot of different economic things are going to affect the growth after the Civil War. We have all these abundant, natural resources that we now have access to now that Manifest Destiny is complete. We have this large supply of cheap labor. I mean, the war's over, and we have, cheap labor, throughout the North, and we have immigrants coming in, so that's going to give us more cheap labor. So all of that's going to affect the growth. New technology is also going to affect growth. We talked about with steel, the Bessemer-Kelly process, and the Bessemer process was this idea of pushing air into iron to make steel. And steel, we found, was stronger and it was cheaper to make. And what was nice about steel was it was cheaper to make, and it was generally stronger than iron ore, so we could build our buildings even bigger and even taller than they had been before. Now, the guy who capitalizes on this is going to be Andrew Carnegie. And Carnegie is going to start the business of U.S. Steel. Now, Andrew Carnegie was a Scottish immigrant. He's going to basically center himself in Pittsburgh, and he is going to build his corporation on vertical integration. Now, you guys need to remember the difference between vertical and horizontal integration. Vertical integration talks about running a business and owning every part of the production of that business, from the I think with the steel we talked about the iron ore, through the processing, to the shipping, through the marketing, through the selling, all of that. And that's what Carnegie used, was vertical integration. And so keep that in mind. Now, Carnegie is going to eventually sell his corporation to J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan is the financier we talked a lot about. And he is going to buy U.S. Steel and actually turn it into the first billion-dollar corporation. The other big guy we talked about during the Gilded Age is Rockefeller. Now, Rockefeller is going to be opposite than Carnegie, because what Rockefeller is going to use is horizontal integration. And with horizontal integration, what Carnegie does is he takes control of all of the refining. So all he focuses on is refining oil. He doesn't worry about shipping. He doesn't worry about drilling. He just takes the oil and refines it. And that's that horizontal integration where, you own, everything with regards to refining, but as far as shipping everything, you don't. But vertical integration, and I know it's a bad image here, but you basically own every step of the process in order to produce your goods, sell it, and all that other stuff. So make sure you know the difference between horizontal and vertical integration. Couple things I should point out, and I'm going to go back to this other slide here. Andrew Carnegie is going to be involved in what's called the gospel of wealth. Carnegie and others believed that they were gifted this all this money and everything, and then that they should share this money. So you're going to see Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, and others distribute that money into society. Now, they're not going to give out handouts to people, but they're going to do stuff like build libraries and build universities and build art centers and stuff like that. So we'll see that a lot during the Gilded Age. There's J.P. Morgan right there. He's one who bought U.S. Steel. We laughed at his big nose, so you can remember him that way. Once these corporations and everything are growing, what we're going to see is the growth of unions during this time. Now, the very first labor union is going to be formed in 1866. That's going to be the National Labor Union. It's going to be followed up by the Knights of Labor in 1869, followed by the American Federation of Labor in 1886. Now, Samuel Gompers is going to start the American Federation of Labor. That's probably one we're more familiar with today, because this is the AFL is still around today. And the thing with the AFL was, remember, they only took skilled workers. They didn't take, just anybody into their union. So if you were an apprentice electrician, or if you were an apprentice plumber or something like that, you couldn't join the union. So they were basically very selective in who they allowed to come into the union. The result of this is going to be, we're going to see some labor strikes, we're going to see work stoppages, and different tools used to end strikes, like yellow dog contracts, scabs, and then we're also going to see some riots and stuff that result from these strikes. The Haymarket Square riots, probably the most famous one, but you also had the Homestead strike, which resulted in the Pinkertons coming in and fighting, or breaking up a strike at one of Carnegie's steel mills in Homestead. So all of this, make sure you're familiar with the unions, make sure you're familiar with the strikes, the big ones we talked about. The big ones we talked about, like I said, the Homestead strike, the Pullman strike, the Haymarket Square strike. And then I guess, honestly, the first strike you should be familiar with, going back a little bit, is the railroad strike of 1877. And what happened in 1877 when the railroad went on strike was Rutherford B. Hayes set a precedent for other presidents to follow during the Gilded Age, where he is going to actually send in the military to break up that strike. And what we're going to see throughout the Gilded Age is the government using the military to break up strikes in favor of the management, of the owners of these corporations. So they never really side with labor during this time. What else? Immigration. Make sure you know about immigration during this time period. We talked a lot about the old immigrants versus the new immigrants. The old immigrants basically being coming from England and France and Ireland and stuff like that, whereas the new immigrants are focused primarily coming from Eastern European areas, Russia, Poland, Italy, all those areas, and the Hungarian Empire. So during the Gilded Age, we see a whole new wave of immigrants coming in, and these immigrants are going to cause some conflicts in there because they're also going to bring some new political ideas in with them, such as socialism and stuff like that. There's also going to be restrictions placed on immigrants, the biggest one being the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, where the government basically shut the door on all new Chinese immigrants, and that was driven by the fact that basically racism and the idea that the Chinese would come in and work for less money. You actually saw some conflicts in the western states, in one place particular, Rock Springs, Wyoming, in which there was a riot against the Chinese immigrants. So the Immigration Act of 1882 is going to completely shut off all Chinese immigration during this time. Urbanization is going to take off during this time, and urbanization is going to cause a lot of problems in our country. A lot of people are going to be moving to the cities in order, they're looking for jobs and stuff and working in the factories and everything. The problem is the cities aren't properly, I guess, prepared for this influx of new people moving in. One man who shows off what the problems with urbanization is going to be Jacob Riis in his book, How the Other Half Lives. And it's basically a photographic representation of life in the tenements in New York City. And remember, tenement living was not good. I mean, you had families crowded in. They were crowded in. They were living in the dumbbell tenements. There was no ventilation. There was no plumbing. So a lot of disease and everything ran through the tenement slums and made life very difficult. And then for the immigrants coming in, they had no place else to go, so they were living in the tenements as well. And then we also saw the development of our cities. You'd see different neighborhoods building up, based on your nationality. So you had Little Italy and Chinatown and the Russian neighborhood and stuff like that. So we started to see some division throughout our cities of different nationalities, of these different immigrants groups coming in, and this is going to lead to some nationalism and some nativism during the Gilded Age. There's a huge rise of nativism during this time. So just keep that in mind as we look through all this. And a lot of it's spurred on by these political machines. We talked about Boss Tweed a little bit already, but these are the guys who are coming in, and as the immigrants come off the boats, they're offering them jobs, they're offering them places to live, they're offering to help them out, and all they look for in exchange is votes. Well, this is going to lead to political corruption with elections and stuff. And I mean, I told you the story about how some of these political machines, they go out and find men to vote with beards. And then they'd bring the guy in to vote with a beard, then they take him out and shave off the beard and leave a mustache. And then the guy with the mustache would come in to vote, and then they'd take him out and he'd go back and shave off the mustache and he'd come in again and vote. And that kind of stuff went on all the time in the cities. The other political corruption we saw during this time was the spoils system and patronage. And as people got elected, they were giving jobs to those who supported them. I keep going back to Tammany Hall, but it's the perfect example of political corruption. And this is all going to come to a head with the election of James Garfield, because Garfield's going to be elected, and he's going to have a man hunt him down because he actually believed that he was going to get a job because he supported Garfield. And when there wasn't a job in Washington, D.C. for him, he ends up shooting him and assassinating a president. And we said, I had the quote up there, if the spoils system can kill a president, then maybe we should kill the spoils system. And that's going to lead to civil service reform and the passage of the Pendleton Act. And the Pendleton Act is that act that basically makes it illegal to hire someone for the government unless they're qualified. Now you have to take a civil service exam. Now you have to prove you have the right qualifications to do the job. So all of this is going on, and so this is stuff we have to take care of going further. when we talk about the presidency of Cleveland through McKinley, I would just be familiar with the different tariffs that are put in place. There's not a whole lot. I didn't focus, specifically on different presidents. I focused on a few tariffs and stuff, but realize that tariffs are being implemented in order to build American industry. But ask yourself, who are the tariffs hurting? And that's going to lead to the farmers and what they're going through. Economics, we are going to have some economic struggles during this time. Probably one of the biggest one is going to be the Panic of 1893. Throughout the Gilded Age, you had a lot of speculation, a lot of rapid growth, but that rapid growth was not sustainable. And what's going to happen is people are going to overextend. They're going to take out loans they can't pay back. And what's going to happen is in 1893, the Pennsylvania Railroad is going to go bankrupt. And when when that happens, it's going to hurt a lot of other connecting businesses and stuff. That's going to lead to a depression in 1894, and we're going to see high unemployment. In fact, unemployment gets up to 20%, and the government has to figure out how to deal with it. Now, that's 1/5 of the workforce that was unemployed during this time. One area one group of people that was hurt very hard or very, specifically is going to be the farmers. And the farmers are struggling. Now, I've said it time and time again in my class. Every time there is an economic panic, the people who get hurt the most are typically the farmers. They get hit first and they get hit the worst. Now, throughout the Gilded Age, the farmers, you were seeing a lot of people moving into the cities, but that didn't mean that our farming population was going down. We talked about it in class where over half of our population were farmers at this time. And during the 1870s, 1880s, we started going through a drought that affected farming. And you started seeing farmers losing everything because they can't pay back the loans they have. And then they try to get more loans and they're not able to due to these economic panics that we're hitting. That we're going into. And one of the panics, the Panic of 1893, what happens is the government basically regains control of the gold supply, and they limit the amount of currency that's being released. In doing that, since there's not enough currency being released, there's not enough currency to give out loans. And if the farmers can't get loans, then they can't operate. This is when we start hearing the discussion of free silver and bimetallism. The idea is, why not use a different metal to support our economic system? And silver was the one that was readily available for all of us because we had had some major strikes of silver throughout the country. The problem is with silver is that it was only being used in the United States. Internationally, everyone was still on the gold standard. So the government is going to be very reluctant to use silver, although they do try to throughout the time period. At one point, we do have a 16-to-1 ratio of producing silver to gold. At one point, we're producing silver freely, but it doesn't help us in the international market, and it's not helping us with regards to our economy. So the government is going to pull back the use of silver, and this is going to split Republicans and Democrats. Republicans are for the gold standard, whereas the Democrats want more of a split between the two. And so it's going to go back and forth, and this is what's going to lead to the rise of populism in our country, because the populists did favor bimetallism. And I'm going to come back and talk a little bit about that in just a little bit, but I want to get through this one, and then I'm going to come back and talk to populism, and I'm going to talk more about William Jennings Bryan and his Cross of Gold speech. But this is all stuff you need to know. Yeah, I'm going to come back to all this, guys, so don't worry about all this. I'm going to skip through all this and actually, yeah. Sorry, I thought this was at the end of my thing. All right, the other thing I want to talk about in this slideshow before I come back to the populists, I don't want to get too far away from Reconstruction, too far away from the South and the West. I want to talk about changes in the South. We know that there's a lot of sharecropping going on. We know there's a crop lien system going on. This was on our last test, but I just want you to be familiar with this because this is the thing that leads to the Jim Crow laws during this time period. Jim Crow was the idea of segregation during the Gilded Age, and we see laws are starting to be passed throughout the South and being supported by the government to segregate blacks and whites in our society. In fact, the one court case you need to know from the Gilded Age, or one of the ones you need to know, is Plessy versus Ferguson. And Plessy versus Ferguson set up separate but equal. So make sure you're familiar with that case and what effects it has, because that is going to be that's a major case that you do need to know, not only during the Gilded Age, but you're going to need to know it throughout the rest of history, is because it's going to come into play over and over again through the early 1900s. The New South, what is that all about? Basically, the New South is rebuilding, getting the Democratic control back in that area and stuff like that. You don't need to know a whole lot about that. You don't have to worry about this here. I thought I blocked all these out, so I'm sorry about that. Maybe that's the end. There we go. This is what I want to talk about. One thing you definitely need to know for this test is you need to know about the Native American Wars. This is going back all the way to before Christmas break, where we started talking about the conquest of the West. Once we completed Manifest Destiny, the ones who are going to suffer the most from that are going to be the Native Americans. Now, during the Civil War, we actually had a Plains Indian War going on as well. So basically, we had two wars going on at the same time. One being the Civil War, one being the Plains Indian War, the War of the West. We talked about the Sand Creek Massacre and what happened there with regards to Colonel Chivington coming in and killing basically unarmed Native Americans, and how he then went and paraded his spoils of war throughout the streets of Denver, and was really not even punished or anything for that. We also talked about the Treaty of Fort Laramie, and the Treaty of Fort Laramie is what's going to set up the Great Sioux Nation, giving them a reservation in the Black Hills, which sounds really good until gold is discovered in the Black Hills. Once gold is discovered, this is when that's going to lead to Custer's last stand at the Battle of Little Bighorn. So be familiar with that. Be familiar with Custer. Be familiar with Sitting Bull. These are the two main players in this one. Custer and all his men were killed at the battle, but this is just the beginning of the end for the Native Americans. Custer, we have made a hero throughout history, but what we really found was that he just kind of was seeking his own hero status in the world, and the natives paid the price for that. Native American wars are going to last until about 1886. The Apache Wars, that they're going to be the last tribe to offer an armed resistance to the U.S. Army. So be familiar with that. What else can I say about this point? The Dawes Act. Make sure you know the Dawes Act. This is the one where they took land from the Native Americans, saying we're going to divide it up, and then they're going to give it back to the Native Americans, much like they did with the Homestead Act. And with that, they said, as long as you keep the land for something like 20 years or something like that, you'll be able to keep it. Unfortunately, the Native Americans weren't prepared to live like the white man, so the Dawes Act is just going to be a way for Native Americans to get the U.S. government to get control of Native American land. They actually called the Dawes Act the Indian Reorganization, or it's going to lead to the Indian Reorganization Act in 1934, the Indian New Deal. We'll talk more about this later, but just keep in mind that Native Americans, we tried to legislate them throughout our history, and we never did it right. So just keep that in mind. One of the first muckrakers that we talked about in class is going to be Helen Hunt Jackson. Helen Hunt Jackson is going to write the book A Century of Dishonor, basically chronicling 100 years of mistreatment of the Native Americans. And she's going to be bluntly honest with it all. So when we talk about the different muckrakers, I touched briefly on Jacob Riis. Helen Hunt Jackson is another one you definitely need to know. So Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives, Helen Hunt Jackson, A Century of Dishonor. Indian Wars are going to conclude with the battle, or not the battle, the massacre at Wounded Knee. This is the last armed conflict between the United States Army and the Native Americans. Just make sure you're familiar with that one as well. This is going to bring an end with the defeat of the Native Americans. This will bring an end to the Western frontier. It's going to bring an end to Manifest Destiny. And forever, basically, like Frederick Jackson Turner says, the frontier is now gone. And we are a settled country from Atlantic to Pacific. So the Manifest Destiny was completed. I showed you guys this slide in class. We did it with homesteads. We did it with railroads. We did it with warfare. So anyway, going into the Gilded Age. So basically when we talk about the Gilded Age, I've talked about Grant's presidency. The Compromise of 1877, make sure you're familiar with that. I talked briefly about some of the robber barons, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Vanderbilt, all those guys. Make sure you're familiar with that. Make sure you know the unions. We touched on immigration, so make sure you know that. I'm going to talk about muckraking here in just a little bit, so hang tight. We're going to talk more about the populist, civil rights we'll talk about, but the Far West and the American Indians, basically we just finished talking about that. Went through it super, super fast. I know that. But there's just so much in there, so I'm counting on you guys to kind of review it and get it up and get it going. The next one I'm going to talk about, I want to get into the populist era, so let me get to the right slide here. If you give me just a second, I will do that. This is a good point. If you have any questions for me, now would be the time to ask before I move on to the next PowerPoint that I want to use. So give me just a second while I do this one and pull this up. No. Any questions at all? Oh, come on. Can't find my PowerPoint. It's here someplace. Here we go. Well, shucks. All right, no questions at all, guys. After all that, that kind of concerns me that no one's asking any questions. So not the PowerPoint I want. Sorry, guys, I'm trying to pull up the right PowerPoint that I want to show you. Because I want to make sure I have everything in here. That's not it. Cancel. All right, I've lost my populist notes, so give me just a second. I will fix it. Right here. Does not want to come up. All right, that's all right. We'll just go straight to this. Here, guys, take a minute. Let me see if I can get this fixed. I'm sorry. I apologize. There we go. Okay. Sometimes everything looks like it's going just right, and then it doesn't work. All right, so let's talk about the populist movement. I guess no one has any questions, so I'm just going to keep going here and continue on. Yeah, that bothers me that no one has any questions. All right, populist, 1890s. When we get into this time period, this is a direct reflection of what's going on with the farmers and stuff like that. So the Populist Party basically started with the Grange and is going to grow from there. And the Grange was that social organization of farmers. And from the Grange, we're going to go into the Farmers Alliance. And from the Farmers Alliance, that's going to grow into the populist movement. Now, the Alliance movement, basically the idea was we're going to bring together all these farmers and they're going to go up against the railroads and try to get cheaper rates and stuff like that. But they're also going to have, you know, their own platform that they're going to introduce to the country. A couple court cases you need to know with regard to the Populist Party during this time. Is my chat not working? Someone just sent me a text, so hang on just a second. This is not good today. My chat's not working at all. Why? Oh my gosh. Okay, guys, I'm getting your text messages, so thank you. I'm going to figure this out. I'm really sorry. I thought I had all this set up, and it's not working the way I want it to. There we go. Okay, now. Okay, so here we go. What major strikes you need to know? Let me get off of this so we can just talk. All right, major strikes you need to know. You need to know the Homestead strike. You need to know the Pullman strike. You need to know Homestead, Pullman, and oh my gosh. The Haymarket strike. So make sure you know those three, and that will help you. Court cases, I'm going to be hitting some court cases just here in a few minutes. The only one I've talked about so far, Caitlin, is Plessy versus Ferguson. I'm getting ready to talk about a few more. Did the closing of the frontier have any bad results or consequences? Yes, ask the Native Americans. Yeah, I mean, that once the frontier closed, I mean, the Native Americans had nowhere to go, and all the Native Americans were living on the reservations at that point. On top of that, you also had the destruction or the dissemination of the buffalo herds and stuff like that. So when we say the frontier closed, what we're really referring to is the idea that it closed in the sense that there's no more growth, there's no more need to I guess it's closed to all those except the settlers. Does that make sense? I hope. But other than that, yeah. So the negative effects primarily on the Native Americans and the buffalo. So okay. So hopefully that answers that question. I think that's all the questions I got. I just got the 3 questions. So see why that's not working, but I'll keep double checking back there. All right. So now are we ready to go on to the populist movement at this point? Let's see what we got here. Okay, so let me get to this one here. This is a couple of the court cases you need to know, Caitlin. This is kind of referring to what you were just asking. You need to know Munn versus Illinois. You need to know Wabash versus Illinois. Now, Munn versus Illinois is when basically the state of Illinois is going to declare that the railroads are like public highways, so they're going to be able to regulate what goes on there, and they're going to be able to set prices and stuff like that. And this will lead to, this is going to go to court, and my gosh, it's still going on. Going to court, and the court is going to rule in favor of the state of Illinois, saying, yeah, it's all right, they can regulate that. Later, 10 years later, in Wabash versus Illinois, the court's going to come back and say, no, states cannot regulate interstate railroad rates under the Interstate Commerce Clause. And the Interstate Commerce Clause basically gives the government the power to regulate trade between states. And since those rail lines run from state to state, they can be regulated by the federal government. This is when the government is going to start the Interstate Commerce Act, or pass the Interstate Commerce Act, that's going to create the Interstate Commerce Commission. And what this is going to do is it's going to stop the railroads from lobbying state governments. It's going to repeal the grange laws that were kind of set up by Illinois to help them, and those grange laws are what regulated the rates for the railroads and stuff like that. So basically, these two cases established the Interstate Commerce Commission, which is now going to oversee the railroads and start regulating the railroads in the country. Now, the Populist Party is going to evolve during this time. And we talked briefly about the Ocala demands of the Populist Party. And the Ocala demands are going to basically go into what's known as the Omaha Platform. The Omaha Platform is the Populist Party platform, and it's everything we talked about. It's reducing tariffs. It's a graduated income tax. It's public ownership of the railroads. It's the direct election of senators. And we didn't talk about a federally funded irrigation research, but that was part of it. They had a nativist attitude where they didn't want any immigrants to get any new lands. They wanted the free coinage of silver. They wanted the federal government to store goods, farm goods, in federal warehouses and pay for that. And it's also going to help set up, law or basically low cost or low interest rate loans for for farmers during this time. So that's what the Populist Party is trying to do, is get all this incorporated. And this is going to be the movement across our country during the 1890s. In 1892, they're actually going to nominate someone to run for president, and that's going to be James Weaver. Now, James Weaver is not going to win the election. He instead is going to only get about 8.5% of the popular vote. But what we do see happen with the populists is we see that they're going to, start getting some power in the House and the Senate. Now, it doesn't give them a lot of power in the national government. Where they do have a lot of power is in the state governments. And we see several populist governors elected during this time. We see state legislatures bring in a lot of populist legislatures. Now, Grover Cleveland is going to be elected in the election of 1892. I mean, there's some free trivia for you. He's going to repaint the White House white, so there you go. This is Grover Cleveland's second term as president. He had been president once before, and then Benjamin Harrison came in between. Now Grover Cleveland's coming in for his second term. Little bit, I'm going back to the Panic of 1893 because I kind of went through it awfully quickly, and I wanted to break it down a little bit more for you here, where the Reading Railroad and the Pennsylvania Railroad do go bankrupt. And what's going to happen is all of the banks, all of the companies that are tied to this railroad are going to collapse. This is going to cause the stock market to crash as well. Europeans are going to start pulling their investors out of your American companies. And because of what's going on with the farmers in the West due to the agriculture, this is going to help give rise to the Populist Party. It's going to kind of light a fire under their movement. This will lead us to the election of 1896. The election of 1896, we're going to basically be introduced to William Jennings Bryan. And William Jennings Bryan is going to run on he's a Democrat, but he's actually running the populist platform. And William Jennings Bryan, we talked about how during the Democratic National Convention, when he is nominated, he is going to give his Cross of Gold speech. And that speech was against the gold standard. Remember, I have the quote right there, or I don't have the quote when he talks about the Cross of Gold, but he goes, "We're not going to let this crown of thorns be placed down on our labor, nor carry this cross of gold through our streets." He wants bimetallism. He wants, the free coinage of silver, and that's what he's going to run on. Now, he's going to be running against William McKinley. William Jennings Bryan is going to start this campaigning throughout the entire country. He's going to do whistle-stop campaigns throughout the country. And at each stop, he's going to give his Cross of Gold speech and talk about and try to educate Americans about why the silver is so important during, to the monetizing silver is so important. Now, McKinley, on the other hand, is just going to do what's called the front porch campaign, where he is literally going to sit on his front porch and let the press come to him, and he will campaign through the press. And his campaign manager is going to be Mark Hanna, and Mark Hanna is going to go around and collect a lot of money from corporations, not like a quid pro quo, not to get, something from the spoil system, but instead to protect the gold standard. And we're going to see the beginning of campaign financing during this time, when they're donating money to a campaign in order to get a specific political idea across. Now, Hanna is and McKinley's going to win this election, but Bryan's not going to go away, and I don't want you to think he's going to go away. Don't worry about this. I'm going to skip that one. All right, so that's kind of the populist movement and what they were trying to do during this time. So I'm going to stop right here and say, do you guys have any questions about populism? And again, I don't know, something's going on here, and hopefully the comments will pop up. But do you guys have, what questions do you have about the 1890s and populism? And I'm actually also going to go to my phone too. So if you want to send a question on my phone, I'm going to go ahead and start answering that, since YouTube is not really cooperating with me right now. So any questions about populism during this time? No questions? I'm looking, scrolling down. Lynn is basically growling next to me. Okay, so no questions about populism. None on my phone. Looking. Okay, so let me go find the next PowerPoint. Oh, wait. Do you need to know all the parts of the Omaha platform demands? Caitlin, know the Ocala demands. I didn't have that up on the screen, but if you know the Ocala demands, you'll be fine. You didn't need to know all those parts about the Omaha I had up there. That was just a different PowerPoint, but definitely know the Ocala ones, okay? So if you know those, you'll be fine. Okay? All right. Let's see what else we got here. Let's do TR first. All right, I'm going to do TR first. Let me get this one up and running real quick. Close this one out. No, I don't want to save it. All right. Going into the 20th century, we are going to, let me make sure we're here. What did I just hit? We're going to talk about the first president of the 20th century, and that's TR. TR is going to be the first president. He's going to take over for McKinley after McKinley is going to be assassinated. One thing, real quick thing about McKinley. McKinley was definitely pro-tariff. He had the McKinley Tariff of 1900. Just make sure you're familiar with that. Actually, just remember that the Republicans are definitely pro-tariff, so just keep that in mind. TR, he's going to come in. Now, TR is going to be a progressive Republican. He actually is going to look at a lot of the things the populists want and see the benefit of those, but he also sees the benefit of big business. And so he's going to try to walk the line between the two, and he's going to actually do a pretty good job doing it. He is going to introduce us to the next time period, which is called the progressive time period. Now, without the populists, we would not have the progressives. So I got this little, graphic here, progressivism, that everything that kind of falls under this time period. The muckrakers are under there. The suffragettes are under there. The populists are going to evolve into the progressive era. They're going to turn into the progressives. The temperance movement is during this time. We're going to see the growth of a middle class and women growing during this time. We're going to see labor unions still around during this time, and civil rights are going to be something that's continually going on during this time. I am honestly going to focus on the left side of the umbrella. The muckrakers, the suffragettes, the populists, and temperance movement. Those are the big things you need to know during this time period. as we go on, we'll get more into labor unions, civil rights, and stuff like that, but that's not so much on this particular exam. When it comes to Teddy Roosevelt, make sure you know his square deal. And I want you to remember that the square deal means the fair deal. It's about being fair for all. He gets that name from the anthracite coal strike, and we talked about that, how he went in and got both sides of the labor union, both the labor union and the owner of the coal mine, to sit together and collectively bargain a bargain that would get the coal miners back to work and make the management happy. And so it was called a square deal then, and then Teddy's economic, or his political plan for the United States, is also going to be known as the square deal, and it has the 3 C's: the control of corporations, consumer protection, and conservation of natural resources. We know that Teddy Roosevelt, he saw the benefit of corporations in our country, but he also knew that some of these corporations, these monopolies, were bad for our country. So he is going to be also known as the trust-busting president. Now, the control of the corporations, when he's talking about that, he's looking at trust, that if they can be restrained, if government can regulate certain monopolies, they could be a good thing for our country. But if these monopolies will not follow regulation, if they go out on their own, they should be put down. And we're going to see Teddy Roosevelt put down like 44 trusts during his presidency. The other side is going to be consumer protection, and that's going to be as a result of the muckraking journal, The Jungle. Upton Sinclair wrote that book about the meatpacking plant, and we're going to see different laws passed, such as the Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. Those are going to be passed in order to protect the consumer during this time period. And then finally, there you go, the Pure Food and Drug Act and the Meat Inspection Act. And finally, conservation of natural resources. Teddy Roosevelt believed our natural resources should be protected. He said we should use our natural resources, but not waste them. And during his presidency, he is going to set up a legacy of conservation. Game preserves, national parks, national monuments, national forests. He is going to start all of this during his presidency. 230 million total acres that will be set aside during Teddy's presidency to protect those natural resources. So remember, when you think of the square deal, think of the square as fair, think about the conservation, think about control of the corporations, and think about consumer protection. One guy who is going to advise TR during this time is John Muir. John Muir is a conservationist. He believed in the preservation of the wilderness. He started the Sierra Club. Just be familiar with his name, because generally there's a lot of short answer questions or basically stimulus-based questions that have some of his writings in there. And just know he is coming from the conservation viewpoint. Muckrakers. So we talked about muckrakers in the class, and we know that muckrakers basically are 20th century writers who are exposing corruption and scandals in business and politics during this time. The big muckrakers you need to know: Upton Sinclair. He's going to write The Jungle, which attacks the meatpacking industry. Be familiar with Ida Tarbell. Ida Tarbell is going to expose Standard Oil Company and John Rockefeller and some of their business practices and what they're doing wrong. Ida Wells she writes against the lynching that's happening in the South under the New South and Jim Crow, and she will write about that. Ida Wells, you can honestly compare a lot to, she's writing, nonfiction, but you can compare her to like Harriet Beecher Stowe and Uncle Tom's Cabin, just the mistreatment of people in the South, of the African Americans. Lincoln Stevens is going to write The Shame of the City, that talks about the political decay of our cities during this time. So just know who the muckrakers are and some of the stuff they wrote about. The big thing you need to know from the Progressive Era, maybe during this time, is what happened in the election of 1912. Election of 1912 is when William Howard Taft was the president. He's going to run for re-election, but Teddy Roosevelt does not like the job he's doing. So Teddy Roosevelt's going to come in and reinsert himself in the political scene. And so the main candidates, we all know, obviously, William Howard Taft, the president, will represent the Republican Party. His goal, he wanted to defeat, obviously, Teddy Roosevelt, keep conservative progressivism going. He was, as a Republican, was more conservative than Teddy, so he tended to lean more towards laissez-faire politics. He tended to like the tariffs because that increased American business and stuff like that. When we talk about the Republican Party platform, you don't need to know about all this stuff, guys. We're going to talk about some of the stuff they're for and some of the stuff they're against, but I put this up there because there's key terms you need to know in here. You need to know about the tariffs. You need to know about initiatives, referendums, and recalls. You need to understand good trust versus bad trust, the gold standard. These are the things that you need to know about during this time period, okay? You don't necessarily need to know the Republican platform, but definitely know the language of the Republican platform that you're seeing up here. When we get to TR, basically TR is saying that the Republicans are getting too far away from that progressive ideal of protecting humans and what the muckrakers were trying to expose. And so they had to stand up for those people, and that's what he's going to do. When the Republicans do not nominate him, he is going to start his own party, the Progressive Party, also known as the Bull Moose Party. And he said that basically that the government and people should rise above their own special interest to bring good to the society. And that's what he's standing for in this part. He is going to introduce the idea of new nationalism. That will be his platform during this time. So make sure you're familiar with new nationalism. Basically, what he wants is a bigger government. Taft wants more of a small government, and actually Wilson does too, but TR sees the need for big government because he says we have these big business figures in our country, so we need big government to regulate them. Don't worry about that. The Bull Moose Party, basically, be familiar with that term and be familiar with this cartoon here. I showed you this in class, so make sure you know about that. Just the Progressive Party platform. This is the new nationalism that he stood for. Women's suffrage, graduated income tax, lower tariffs, currency reform, minimum wage, abolition of child labor. These are some of the things that Roosevelt stood for in new nationalism. Just be familiar with the big things that we talked about in class. Look at what's on here. You can just tie this back to the the Populist Party platform and stuff like that. All of that is part of it. Now, he's for women's suffrage. Remember, TR was the first presidential campaign to use women to campaign for him. So just keep that in mind. I'm picking up the pace here a little bit because we've been doing this a long time. Eugene Debs is going to be running under the Socialist Party. He was also in the election of 1908. He was in the election of 1904. He was in the election of 1896. Debs has been around for a long time, and they have their own platform during this time. Don't worry about the Socialist Party platform, but just, you can see some of the things they have in there that is very familiar to you, like the 8-hour workday, women's suffrage. They are also government ownership of railroads and utilities. That's kind of a tie-in with the Populist Party. So you can kind of see the Populist Party is still alive and well, even though they don't actually have a candidate or anything at this point. Finally, Democrat Woodrow Wilson's going to run. He is going to come in. He's going to introduce New Freedom. New Freedom is going to be about government control of the monopolies. Actually, he wanted a one-term president. He wanted to see the direct election of senators. He wanted a Department of Labor. He's going to push for the strengthening of the Sherman Antitrust Act. That will later become the Clayton Antitrust Act. That's what he gets. They do not support women's suffrage. So that's, whereas the progressives and the progressives support women's suffrage, the Republicans and Democrats do not. The results of the election, because Roosevelt and Taft are both pulling from Republicans, Wilson is going to win hands down, and he is going to take the presidency in 1912. What's interesting is, and this is just kind of a fun fact, and I don't know why I'm throwing this in there, but William Jennings Bryan ran for the Democratic ticket in 1908 and lost. And Wilson's going to run in 1912. He's going to win, but he's going to actually get 100,000 less votes than Bryan got in 1908. Wilson only got 42% of the popular vote. What this demonstrates is the power of the Electoral College. It also demonstrates a third-party candidate coming in and splitting a ticket. We talked about that, how that happened in the election of 1860 with Lincoln. He got elected because the Democrats were split. We're going to see that happen again in 1992 with George H.W. Bush and Clinton, because H. Ross Perot is going to come in and split the Republican ticket. So, just, food for thought that you got to keep in the back of your mind. And then, of course, I showed you this cartoon, how a bull moose into the Republican Party actually ends up bringing us a Democrat. So keep that in mind. Basically, the election changed politics in America. We'll talk about that later. Don't worry about this. I want to get past this. I'm just flying because all this is later. Woodrow Wilson is going to introduce his new freedom. His first term is going to be all about domestic policy. In fact, that was Woodrow Wilson's specialty, was domestic policy. But what we talked about was his second term is going to be overshadowed by World War I, so he's not going to be able to get a lot of stuff done. But things he does get done. He gets the Federal Reserve System put in place. This is basically, it says the bank, but we don't have a national bank. What we have is government control over the monetary supply and government control over interest rates that banks are issuing. So the Federal Reserve System is going to get its start under Wilson's presidency. The Underwood-Simmons Act is going to be put in place. And what this is going to do is it's going to reduce protective tariffs. And in doing that, that's going to increase American industry. And then finally, the Clayton Antitrust Act. This was put in place to strengthen the Sherman Antitrust Act, and it's going to make injunctions illegal. It's going to make unions and strikes legal. So it's going to actually give more power to the labor side of business. You can look at Woodrow Wilson's domestic policy and you can see some success in there. Some antitrust legislation is going to be passed. Business is going to grow during this time, which is important. The currency is going to be stabilized because now we're just on the gold standard. But it's really, what we're really going to see from Wilson's presidency is the man he becomes during World War I, the type of president he is, and we'll talk more about that after this exam. Constitutional amendments that are passed during this time period, like I told you, constitutional acts kind of run in packs like wolves. So you're going to have the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th amendments passed during this time. The 16th Amendment is going to set up an income tax. The 17th Amendment is going to set up the direct election of U.S. senators. The 18th Amendment is going to be prohibition. And the 19th Amendment is going to give women the right to vote in our country. Leaders of the women's suffrage movement, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, they're the ones who started. They are going to lead to the next generation of Carrie Catt and Alice Paul. Suffrage is going to be a huge fight during the 19-teens, going up to 1920. In fact, women are actually going to protest at the White House trying to get the right to vote. And they will get that right when the 19th Amendment is passed. All right, so that's the end of that PowerPoint. And basically, that's a lot of everything, really fast, really jammed together, really all over the place. Questions, guys. I know there's a lot on this test, but now it's the time to ask questions. Text them to me, or put them here on the screen. But this is what I want to see, what questions you have going into the test tomorrow. I'm here. I'll sit here with you as long as I need to. Quinn's outside, so he's happy and he's not bugging me. So what else do you need to know about this time period? Everything we need to cover, from the conquest of the West and the Native Americans to immigration coming in, to the rise of big business, to what was Wilson running on? What was he campaigning for? Wilson was running on the New Freedom platform, and the New Freedom platform, the idea was basically lower the government involvement, reduce tariffs, standardize the money supply. Basically, we had the gold currency there, gold standard currency. So those were the things he was pushing for, versus the populist platform that TR was running for, and the Republican platform that Taft was running on. Taft and TR were very close and similar in their platforms. But what TR had on his was more of the populist ideas of, knocking down the bad trust and stuff like that. Taft, however, while TR was known as the trust buster, Taft actually broke up more trust than TR did. So he broke up 90 trusts to TR's 44. But when Wilson came in, he came in on a domestic platform, just kind of keep the status quo. Like I said, all the stuff that he was able to pass once he became president, that's what he was running on. So I think your good bet is to look at that. So hopefully I answered your question. What other questions do you guys have, guys? I'm really sorry about all the technical problems today. I thought I had it all set up properly, and it just didn't work the way I wanted it to. So I do apologize for that. Anything else? Got no text messages coming in. I appreciate you guys all sticking with me throughout all this. Not seeing a lot of questions. Don't see any, so I really want to, I think you guys have more questions than you're asking. I want to give you every opportunity to ask them. I don't want to just shut this off and then start getting a lot of text messages and stuff or anything like that. The test, let me just tell you a little bit about the test. It's going to have, 37 questions on it, all multiple choice, all stimulus based. We're going to do the multiple choice tomorrow, and then on Tuesday, you're going to come in and do a short answer question. Come here. You want to see him? Flynn's hanging out here. I don't know if he's going to jump up here or not. So okay, is there going to be anything about the Chinese Immigration and Exclusion Act? Basically, the Chinese Exclusion Act, Ishan, what you need to know is in 1882, we passed a law that basically shut the door on all Chinese immigrants coming into our country. This was tied to the nativist move in our country to, keep immigrants out. The Chinese were seen as a threat because they would work for a lot less money, especially in the West on the railroads and stuff like that. The Chinese were also seen as different, than us. So that nativist idea came in and we said, we just want to exclude them. So the Chinese Exclusion Act, just know that basically they are going to, they're going to exclude all Chinese immigrants coming into our country. That's 1882. That's one of the first immigration acts that we have that actually breaks down who we're going to let in and who we're not going to let in. We're going to see more of that as we get further into the 1920s and stuff like that. So, but hopefully that answers your question. Can you remind me about Little Bighorn again? Yes, I can. Little Bighorn happened after the Fort Laramie Treaty, and the Fort Laramie Treaty came about when the U.S. government sat down with the Sioux Nation and said, you know what, we're just going to give you the Black Hills of South Dakota, and with the Black Hills, we'll keep American out. Remember, there was a move to get the Bozeman Trail built there, and the government's going to back off and say, no, we're not going to build the Bozeman Trail. We're going to, we're going to shut off the Black Hills to American development, and we promised that under the Fort Laramie Treaty. Well, then what's going to happen, Kayla, is gold is going to be discovered in the Black Hills. And with the discovery of gold, you can't stop the movement of settlers moving in that, because gold is going to just kind of drive people, kind of be that pull and push factor of people in there. So you're going to have a lot of people going in there. And so Sitting Bull and Crazy Horse, they're going to bring in all the entire Sioux Nation. and they're basically going to start, the Sioux ghost dance and stuff like that. Now, what's going to happen is Custer and the military is going to move in with the idea that they are going to protect the settlers coming in. They're ignoring the Fort Laramie Treaty, and the battle at Little Bighorn is going to happen when Custer and his men are going to go in. They're going to face an ambush by the Sioux Native Americans. They're going to pretty much wipe out Custer and all his men. Custer is going to be made a hero in the newspapers, and Americans are going to start calling for revenge against Sitting Bull and the Native Americans, and that's just going to drive the Plains Indian Wars even further. So that's what that was all about. Now we know that Custer was more of a glory seeker, and so he made mistakes going to Little Bighorn. He actually had other units that were supposed to go with him, but he went ahead without them, and that's going to lead to the death of all his soldiers. But like I said, it's going to drive American hatred towards the Native Americans because Custer will be painted as a hero in the newspapers, and people will be calling for revenge of that. Morgan, just before I get to Caitlin's question, Morgan, you sent me a question. She asked about who was Henry Grady. We didn't talk a lot about Henry Grady, but Henry Grady was pushing this idea of a new South and moving industry into the South. And so that's what that was all about. And he pushed this idea that there was a lot of labor available, especially in the upper South. And so maybe industry should move down into that area. And you're going to have people in the South agree that industry should come down. In fact, Birmingham, Alabama is going to become the center of iron and steel manufacturing. It's going to be called the Pittsburgh of the South. So when we talk, if you see anything about the New South, they're just referring to this idea of moving industry into the southern states. Caitlin, you're going to ask, when did nativism really spark in the time period? Honestly, Caitlin, nativism sparked with the building of the railroad, but then it's really, we knew it existed already in our country because we saw it like in the 1840s and 50s with the Know Nothing Party. So it's still there under the surface, but then when you see this huge wave of new immigrants coming in and going into the cities and the fight for jobs and everything, and then that panic of 1893 hits when unemployment reaches such high levels, and so there's this competition for jobs in our country, and those who have been here look at the immigrants coming in and see them as direct competition for jobs. So you're going to have that nativism rise up even more, really in the 1890s, but it's kind of always been there. Are you going to need to know the specifics of all the native awards agreements? Or I would know the Treaty of Fort Laramie. I would know that one. But other than that, I would just be familiar with like the Sand Creek Massacre and Wounded Knee. Those are the two big ones you need to know about during that time period. Okay, so yeah, I get to talking about some of this stuff, and I like to tell the stories, but you don't necessarily need to know about it. But definitely know Fort Laramie Treaty, that leads to Little Bighorn. Okay, what else do we need? What other questions? No more text. Go through your review sheet, see if there's anything on there you don't know, and I can tell you about. Flynn's right here. I think he wants his dinner. What? Come here. Come here. No, he doesn't want to jump up. I can't get him to jump up anymore. There he comes. Come here. No questions, guys. Couple more minutes. Let me make sure I got everyone's questions in here. Yeah. Okay. All right, maybe I should just get Flynn in here. Still 23 of you with me, so come on, get up. All right. No text messages. All right, guys, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and call it. Come here, you. Get up here. Get up here. Come say hello to everybody. Hello, say hello, hello, hello. Ow, ow. Let's get up and play. Get up and play. Oh, that was nasty. Okay, so anyway, all right, guys, that's all I have for right now. Hopefully, I didn't throw you too off course. We spent about the last hour and 20 minutes dealing with a whole bunch of technical issues, dealing with PowerPoints that didn't want to come up. Oh wait, here comes another question. Not going to let go. How much about the annexation of new territory do we need to know? Don't worry about it. Morgan, that's a good question. We really covered the annexation of new territory on the last exam, so you really don't need to know a lot about it on this one. Maybe know about Seward's Folly and the purchase of Alaska, but other than that, don't worry about any other annexation. So you're good on that. Okay. Lynn's over here. Okay. All right. Hopefully we got through it all. Like I said, I apologize for all the technical problems. I apologize that it didn't go as smooth as I wanted it to, and I apologize for the lack of sound at the beginning. There's a lot on this, a lot going on here. The assimilation Ellis Island, don't worry about that. Don't worry about that, Kayla. Ellis Island, we're going to talk a little bit about next week. Assimilation, that's with the Native Americans. That's with the Dawes Act, and then we had the Indian Carlisle schools. Just be familiar with that. I'm trying to think. I'll be honest. I just don't think there's a lot about that on the exam. But do know that the idea with assimilation was trying to make the Native Americans a white, basically, and the Carlisle School was to do that. And with the passage and the opening of the Carlisle School, what we saw was these Native American children are taken there, and their culture is stripped away, and they get to a point where they don't belong in white society and they don't belong in Native American society, and we just kind of leave them out to dry. So if you're familiar with that, I think you will be okay. So, okay. Oops, something else just came through. What was that? All right, nothing else there. All right, just checking everything. All right, so I hesitate because there's a lag on the video here, and so when I say I'm done, and right when I get ready to click off, that's when a question comes up. So I'm going to sit here with some dead air for about 3 minutes, and when I think we've covered it all, then I'm going to go ahead and shut it off. I think you guys just study, know the information, you'll be fine. I think just take your time, like I talked about in class. Remember to take your time reading the questions, take your time reading the answers, and you'll be fine. So, few minutes here, dead air. It's me just looking around. All right, guys, I'm going to go ahead and cut it off. I hope you have a good evening. We will see you tomorrow. I have a hungry puppy over here that is starving, so I got to go feed him, and I got to go feed myself too. So have a great evening, and we will see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.